Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm going to attempt to compile a list of the top 25 PlayStation 2 video games of all time. I say attempt because, full disclosure, I did not have a PS2 back in the day. I had a GameCube, and I fucking loved the GameCube, and I will defend the GameCube to the death. I miss it, I love it, and it was, in my opinion, the console to own in that generation, and the PS2 was just fucking out there. I had no interest in it back in the day. I didn't get a PS2 until 2013, and I would say, marginally explored it. So, my list of these games are going to be based on my experiences. And most of my experiences were either looking for games that I had previously enjoyed on the GameCube from that period, just to see how the PS2 versions stacked up, or looking for games that were unique or exclusive to the PS2, barring the Xbox, which I have no experience with. So it was like exclusive games. So I did explore the PS2 library off and on. So I have an extensive list of games here. But I want to make sure I'm very clear that my experiences are very limited. So we're going to start off all the way at the bottom. Number 25 is a game you've probably heard of. And you've probably played, because it does have a modern, I would say, remake, but probably re-release. I'm not sure 100%. But the game is called Destroy All Humans. Now, what I like about Destroy All Humans is, one, it's kind of a fun-ass game. It's a throwback to retro sci-fi B-movies of the 50s, as well as, Mars Attacks, etc. And you can do a lot of fun stuff in this game. I'm fairly, 100% this was not on the GameCube, because had it been on the GameCube, I would have played it on GameCube. I'm fairly certain it was on, I know 100% it was on PS2. I'm fairly certain it was also on Xbox. And there's a possibility it was available on PC. But anyways, Destroy All Humans was a very fun, unique game back in the day. That, to me, I wouldn't go so far as to say defined the PS2 itself necessarily, but definitely defined that era in gaming, and is absolutely worth investigating. Number 24 is a game that was on the GameCube, and I had it on the GameCube. Currently have it on PS4. But it was also on PS2. And this is Balers Gate Dark Alliance. Now, this game was one of those multi-platform games that was on everything. Balers Gate is a very good, very robust interpretation of the advanced Dungeons & Dragons game system. This one, Dark Alliance, was updated to the recently released at the time 3rd edition rule set, which was a big revision. The game itself is known for being, pretty linear, as were a lot of the role-playing games in the Dungeons & Dragons family of games. And it is also very difficult depending on which type of character you play as. But it's still a good fantasy setting, a lot of references to D&D lore, and it's a good, solid Western-style RPG. Number 23 is one of those games that I know it was on PC because everybody fucking had it on PC back in the day. I missed out on playing this version on PC. I got one of the sequels later in life. But I did try this game on PS2, and it's a solid PS2 game. I'm not certain if this game was on... I'm going to reference the GameCube, okay? I'm going to, because it's what I had. So my reference point is, was it on GameCube? That's my reference point. I don't know if this game was on GameCube or not. I know there were games in this franchise on GameCube, but I think it was an example of... GameCube had a lot of, like, GameCube versions of games that weren't, like, the real version everybody else had, if that makes sense. The game is called The Sims. What I like about The Sims is, at a time where we were really pushing, you know, at the time... 3D graphics and more open world games and more realistic gameplay, we were really heavily focused on, like, what do you call it? I would say sci-fi and fantasy type game settings, role-playing games, you know, first-person shooters like Doom and Unreal and stuff like that. So, like, to get a ultra-realistic game that was a life sim was kind of a breath of fresh air. You know, The Sims, as a not a franchise, but genre that we had up to this point were like SimAnt, SimEarth, SimCity, etc. They were hyper-focused. This one was just you and your character, your avatar, living their regular everyday life. And maybe they had a job, maybe they had a family, maybe they had kids, maybe you had pets, whatever. It was fun. Number 22, I'm going to cut the bullshit. I know for a fact this was a PS2 exclusive, because this was a game that pissed me off that it was a PS2 exclusive at the time, because I felt it should have been on GameCube, all things considered. But it was a fun game. I really enjoyed it a lot at the time. I don't know if I would revisit it today, but honestly, I'm not really revisiting the PS2 today anyways. But the game is Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks. Now, basically, Shaolin Monks is sort of a 3D action-adventure beat-em-up that retells the story of Mortal Kombat 2, but through the perspective of a beat-em-up style game rather than a 2D fighting game. And it's a pretty cool game. It's a pretty interesting concept. Number 21 was of the era. This was the new 3D open world sandbox type game was just becoming a thing. This is one of those games. This is one of those games that actually was on GameCube because I had it on GameCube and that's where I experienced it. So when I got a PS2, this was one of the first games I got for the PS2 because it was one I had remembered having on GameCube, and it was considerably more accessible for the PS2, considering that it was like $5 versus the outrageous whatever they wanted for the GameCube version, because the GameCube didn't sell worth a shit. So in the aftermarket, the games are expensive. So this is a game I was glad was on the PS2 because I was able to get it for a fair price. It is True Crime Streets of LA. This basically took the Grand Theft Auto formula and turned it on its head. Instead of being a thug, running from the police, in this game, you're the police, and you're hunting the thugs. So, it plays like, more or less, Grand Theft Auto of the time, but you're the cop. So, I don't know, whatever. It was okay. We didn't have Grand Theft Auto on the GameCube, so this was our, if you were a GameCube owner, this was our Grand Theft Auto. This was as close as we could get. Number 20 is another one that at the time was a PS2 exclusive, and it was a big deal that this was a PS2 exclusive, because the company that made it, both companies that were involved in the making of it, had previously been very friendly to Nintendo. Some of the big iconic games in franchises that these two companies had done in the past were Nintendo staples. So for Kingdom Hearts to be a Disney-themed Final Fantasy game not on a Nintendo console was a stab in the back. It was a big fucking stab in the back. Because up until a certain point, every major Disney game that was released was on the GameCube, with like a handful of exceptions. And every Final Fantasy game up to a certain point was on a Nintendo console, with a handful of exceptions. So to lose Final Fantasy was a blow. To lose Disney, which there were plenty of Disney games on the GameCube, don't get me wrong, but for them to make this game a PS2 exclusive when it, by all rights, should have been a GameCube exclusive, really offended me. Now, I was able to play this game years later. First on disc, I had the actual PS2 version, and then I was able to get one of the HD remakes on the PS4, which is how I play it today. That being said, this was sort of the early 2000s PS2 era style of Final Fantasy. That is to say, more of a action-based combat system rather than the turn-based, card-based system that we were previously used to. So it was still a fun game. It was kind of a foreign concept to me as a person who grew up with traditional Final Fantasy games, but it was still a fun game. I enjoyed it. Number 19 is one that was also on the GameCube. This one I have to talk about because it's one of the few PS2 games I still own to this day. One of the few. I only have like 3 or 4 PS2 games to this day. I pretty much got rid of my PS2 library. Mostly because most of my PS2 games I have, or that I had in the past, I have on PS3 and PS4 digitally. So there's no reason to keep the discs around when I could sell them to the used video game store for cash. But I have to talk... This is a game I have to talk about the GameCube version because this is one of the exceptions where the GameCube version was actually the better game. I have played it extensively on both versions. The game is called Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life. Now, only A Wonderful Life was available on PS2. The rest of the Harvest Moon games of the time were all on GameCube. Which made sense because Natsumi and the Harvest Moon franchise had been staples of Nintendo. So it made sense that your Nintendo gamers would play Harvest Moon games because, we grew up with them. However, the GameCube version is slightly better in that you have... Well, one, it has a better frame rate. It actually really does. A noticeably better frame rate because the GameCube's more powerful hardware. A lot of people don't believe this, but it is actually true. But also because when you start out on the GameCube version, you get access to the entire farm. You can farm anywhere. But on the PS2 version, the biggest farm plot is not available to you when you start the game. You actually have to save up money to buy it, which is fucking bonkers. Because it changes the way you play the game. It really does. It makes it harder in the early, starting out in the early phases, and it makes you more careful about your resource management, which again is like, why the fuck would you do this? I don't understand it. I will gladly play the inferior PS2 version today, over the GameCube version because, holy shit, one, getting a GameCube is hella expensive, and two, getting this game on GameCube is beyond my price point. So yeah, I'll suffer through the inferior PS2 version because it's not that different. It's like 90% the same game. Number 18 is another one that was made for the GameCube, and it was intended to be a GameCube exclusive, but due to, financial reasons, the company that made it said, hey, if we put this as a GameCube exclusive, we're going out of business. We need to sell units. So they stabbed the Nintendo gamers in the back, like a lot of these examples are going to be, and they put the game on PS2 anyways. Again, the GameCube version was the, at the time, superior version, but this game has been ported to fucking everything since then, so there's, even better ways to play this game today. But at the time, if you couldn't play it on GameCube, the PS2 version was good enough. And the game is Resident Evil 4. Now, it's interesting because Resident Evil started out pretty much as a PlayStation franchise. Now, there was the one-off on the Sega Saturn, but we don't talk about the Sega Saturn because that's a sore spot in the life of Sega fans like myself, so we try to avoid it at all costs. But the GameCube was interesting, and I have to talk about this because it got the entire Resident Evil franchise up to that point remastered in updated graphics and gameplay. So you had Resident Evil 1 remade using GameCube hardware, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and then Resident Evil 4, initially intended to be a GameCube exclusive, ultimately being a timed exclusive, but it is what it is. It's still a damn good game on the PS2, but the GameCube version was especially if you had the chainsaw controller, was the definitive way to play this game at the time. Number 17 was not only a PS2 exclusive at the time, it was made by Sony. So it has been ported to modern Sony consoles, updated with modern graphics and maybe updated gameplay, which I had the HD version on PS3, which is how I experienced it initially. But I did eventually go back and play the PS2 version, and it's a solid game. It's a late gen game, so it came out late in the PS2's life, so it was when they were, fully versed in how to get the most out of the PS2, which this game definitely pushes it to its limits. The game is God of War. It is basically Sony's... So it was basically Sony's answer to Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series. It was intended to be their big, epic, open-world, 3D, action-adventure, fantasy-based game. Which it was. Fortunately for PlayStation gamers, they were able to capitalize on Nintendo themselves pulling the wool over our eyes and pulling the rug out from under us with the bait and switch that was the Legend of Zelda Space World demo that eventually got replaced with the fucking god-awful Wind Waker, and don't even get me started on Wind Waker. So God of War was like, hey, you remember that Zelda game you wanted to play, but you got stuck with the Little Tykes Tonka version instead? Yeah, we got that game, and it's called God of War, and it's on PS2. So it was a big middle finger to Nintendo fans. But if you played the game, it was a good-ass game. Number 16 was another game that cashed in on the open-world sandbox-style gameplay that was popularized by Grand Theft Auto 3. But again, it took a unique approach in that you're basically a kid in high school, which gives it away. The game is Bully. It's Grand Theft Auto for teenagers, I guess, even though teenagers were playing Grand Theft Auto when they shouldn't have been because it was rated M for adults. M for mature. But whatever, kids played it. But Bully was the, I'm not going to say dumbed down or toned down version of GTA, but it was pretty much GTA for the younger kids. And it was still a fun game. I I happen to know, excuse me, this game was not, I have to mention it, not on GameCube. But I don't know if it was on anything other than PS2 at the time, so I can't definitively say if it was an exclusive or not. But I do know when I got a GameCube, or excuse me, a PS2, it was one of the first games I got because it was one that I remember wanting and being upset that it wasn't on GameCube, so I did play Bully, and it was a fun game. Number 15 actually was on GameCube, but this was a multi-platform. It's a Marvel game. It was a multi-platform that was on everything. And it's a damn fucking good game. It's Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction. This is basically like Rampage for Marvel fans. You know, only better. I love Rampage, don't get me wrong. But this game did it better. Number 14, I have a brief story, and it goes back to GameCube again. This game was originally intended to be a GameCube exclusive. This story gets repeated a lot. But due to financial reasons, you know, because the GameCube wasn't selling and software on the GameCube wasn't selling because assholes were buying PS2 instead of GameCube because they had brain damage back in the day, I guess. I don't know what the explanation is, but whatever. You know, the GameCube was the better system. You should have bought a GameCube, is what I'm trying to get at. But if you didn't, anyways, if you didn't, you're the reason why this game was canceled for the GameCube, even though it was originally intended to be a GameCube exclusive. And then it was not only, instead of being a timed exclusive like Resident Evil 4 or other games, it was just flat out canceled and migrated to the PS2. And there may have been an Xbox and PC port. I know there was a PC port because I had it on Steam or GOG, I can't remember. I had it on one or the other. So I had it on PC for a time, which was how I was able to play it. The game is called Psychonauts, and if you've played Psychonauts, you can tell this game was targeting Nintendo gamers. This was made for people who played Banjo-Kazooie or Donkey Kong 64 or Star Fox Adventures. It was designed with the Nintendo gamer in mind, and yet it wasn't on the Nintendo console. It was inexplicably tossed to die on the PlayStation console, where PlayStation gamers were like, we don't play Nintendo games. We play fucking PlayStation games. So it was not made by Nintendo, but when I call it a Nintendo game, I mean it has that Nintendo aesthetic. It looks and feels and plays like a Nintendo game, inexplicably on a non-Nintendo system. It may or may not have been a financial success, I don't know, but it was a mistake that this game was not on GameCube. But Psychonauts was a damn good game. And if you get a chance to play it, however you're able to, you definitely need to. Number 13, you're going to hear this again, same story. This was not nowhere close to a GameCube exclusive. Actually, this was designed to be a multi-platform game. But it was on the GameCube. Now, this is where I will say the GameCube version is not the best version that's out there. But between the PS2 and the GameCube version, they're nearly identical. But this is where I have to give it to the PS2 version because the PS2 controller is more conducive for this game, whereas the GameCube controller was kind of awkward for this type of game. Which is unfortunate because there weren't a lot of fighting games on the GameCube as a result of that. There were like maybe 6 or 7 total fighting games, depending on how you stretch the definition of a fighting game. But this was the very first game I bought on GameCube, so I know 100% it was on GameCube, because I had it, I played it 100%, meaning I unlocked all the bonus content. It's Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, which is to this day my absolute favorite Mortal Kombat game ever. And I have actually played it on GameCube to 100%, PS2 to 100%, and the original Xbox to 100%. Because I love that game that much. I owned it on all 3 consoles. And if I could play it again, I fucking would. Number 12 is another one of those games where it wasn't ever intended to be on the GameCube, but it could have been because it was made by Capcom, who had a somewhat rocky working relationship with Nintendo during the GameCube era. And it was heavily inspired by a first-party game Nintendo was developing for the GameCube that eventually got migrated to the Revolution, and then it was released on both systems for whatever reason, because, whatever. The game is Okami. It's basically Capcom's, I would say, interpretation of Twilight Princess, basically. Between the two, I'm still gonna play Twilight Princess over Okami, if given the choice. And I'm going to play the GameCube version of Twilight Princess over the Wii version because, Link is left-handed, and he shouldn't have been right-handed on the... that's a whole ordeal. Plus, the motion controls really suck on the Wii version. But anyways, Okami was a really good game on the PS2. And fortunately, it was well-received enough that it got an HD remake on more modern systems down the road. So you can play Okami in its original form on PS2 if you're so inclined, but you can also get a slightly better version on other systems. Number 11 was a game I discovered entirely by accident. When I got my PS2, I basically traded some guy on Craigslist my CDI, my Philips CDI, and a shoebox full of CDI software. I won't call them games, I will call them software. For his PS2 and a shoebox of PS2 games. And this game was included in that stack of games. So I played it and I was like, hey, this is actually fucking fun. There's no tie-in to the GameCube, there's no story there. It's just a game that I happened to stumble across that I really enjoyed tremendously. And fortunately, it got rave reviews enough that it has been either ported to modern consoles or had sequels for a time on modern consoles. I don't know how you say the name of this game. I'm going to butcher it. But I believe it's Katamari Damacy? I don't know how you say it. It's Katamari. You're basically a rubber ball rolling around, picking up junk, trying to become a bigger ball. And that's the gist of it. Number 10 is interesting for a couple of reasons. Personal story time. I remember reading about this in the magazines. Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Informer, maybe not EGM, they may have gone out of business by then, but Game Informer, for sure, maybe Game Pro, I don't remember, but I know for sure I read about it in the magazines, and I got excited for it. I was hyped, and then I found out that, there's no planned port for the GameCube, and then I was pissed. This was, again, the PS2 era, thanks in large part to the Xbox, was the beginning of the first-person shooter flooding the console market as the primary method of delivering video games. Most video games of that era were first-person shooters. Or at least a significant enough portion of them, that even if it wasn't most of them, it felt like most of them. And this is one of those first-person shooters that felt unique for whatever reason. The game is called Black. Now, I don't know if Black has ever been ported elsewhere. I know it was on PS2. I'm pretty sure it was on Xbox, but don't quote me on this. It may have been on PC, but again, I don't know 100%. But Black was, to me, like, if you're going to do a first-person shooter at a time where every game is Call of Duty or Halo or Doom, this is the way to do it, because it's at least interesting and unique enough that it felt like, alright, this is pretty cool. Number 9, I don't have a story. It's a first-party Sony game. It's Jak and Daxter. Moving on. It's a great game. You should definitely play it. Long running series. Number 8 is basically Ratchet and Clank, the first one. This, again, is your typical Nintendo 3D platformer, but it's on the PS2. But it's actually a damn good game. I would argue, I'm a Nintendo fan first, you know this. Now, I have issues with modern Nintendo, but at the time, I've already mentioned it 1,000 times in this video, I had the GameCube, I was loyal to Nintendo. So, I really liked Nintendo's 3D platformers. But for whatever reason, Nintendo abandoned the 3D platformer on the GameCube and went a different direction. And they started making different types of games on the GameCube. So, like the 3D platformers they had on the GameCube just weren't up to par with what we had previously come to expect in the N64 era. So Ratchet and Clank basically felt like a better version of what we were getting on GameCube, and that was like really weird to me because it was like, hey, this is what Nintendo does best, and Sony's over here doing it better. And that frustrated me at the time because I wanted Sunshine or Wario World or whatever game Nintendo put out to be. I wanted there to be a proper 3D Donkey Kong game, and there wasn't. We got Donkey Konga and Donkey Kong, whatever it was called, that you had to use the bongo drums. I can't remember what that game was called. It was fucking dumb. It was like, Jesus Christ, Nintendo, what the fuck are you doing? Whatever. This was the start of my animosity towards Nintendo, because it was like, just give me a fucking proper video game, for God's sake. I don't need goddamn gimmicks. But Nintendo is like known for their gimmicks these days, so I'm gonna bitch about that every chance I get. Ratchet and Clank is the Super Mario 64 for the PS2. Number 7 is another game that was made by Capcom, so this one stings that it wasn't on GameCube. Now, I don't know the backstory of this game, so I don't know if it was ever intended to be on GameCube, or if it was one of those, no, we're just going to put it on PS2 because we want to make money. But it's a damn good game. It is a long-running franchise. They still get new entries to this day, and the original games get remastered in HD on modern consoles to this day. It's called Devil May Cry. And again, this was another one of those 3D, I'm not going to say open world, but like 3D, like realistic type of world, I guess. But like also your, fantasy style martial arts type game. It's just a lot of fucking fun. Number 6 is another game that absolutely was on the GameCube. Again, made by Capcom. And this one, I do believe, was supposed to be a GameCube exclusive, because it was, I believe, part of the infamous Capcom 5. But I'm not 100% on that, because I don't remember the details of the Capcom 5. I just know it was a broken promise that pissed a lot of Nintendo nerds off back in the day, because we were pissed that Capcom said, yeah, we are going to fully commit to the GameCube, and then they backpedaled, and then they just walked away entirely. Left us in the dust. The game was called Beautiful Joe. It was a 2D, side-scrolling, cel-animated action platformer in the style of the old 16-bit, early 32-bit era games, but done on modern consoles. Well, at the time, PS2, GameCube. I don't know if it was on Xbox or not. I don't think it was, but I don't think Capcom was making games for the Xbox at the time. I don't think they had started yet. But anyways, Beautiful Joe was one of those games that got GameCube fans excited to be able to play it. And then it was on PS2, and we were like, well, fuck you then, Capcom, whatever. That being said, I played the PS2 version. It's fine. It's basically the same game. I don't remember any major differences between the two, so I will chalk it up to, yeah, it was okay. If you have a PS2 and you can't get this game on GameCube, the PS2 version will suffice. Number 5 is probably the best first-person shooter of the era that isn't Halo. Now, obviously, Halo was like the king of first-person shooters in that generation. And there's no disputing that. It was like the best one. I mean, it was the most popular one. It was the one that made the Xbox what it was. But this game was multi-platform. Again, it was on PC, it was on Xbox, PS2, and it was on GameCube because I bought it day one on GameCube. Paid $50 for it. Pre-ordered it at GameStop so that I got it on day one. And this was a big deal. This was one of those big blockbuster AAA mega hit type first-person shooter games. Like, this was a big fucking deal. I've played both the GameCube... Well, I played the GameCube version, the PS2 version, and the PC version. They're all good. The game is called Gun. Now, basically, Gun is it's not your standard typical first-person shooter. It's story-based, which is pretty common for first-person shooters at the time, but it's a Western. It's set in the old American West. It's basically Red Dead Redemption before Red Dead Redemption. Only it's as a first-person shooter instead of a open-world sandbox game. But it's a damn good game. And I would definitely play it again if I had the option to. Number 4 is not the only Final Fantasy for the PS2, but I will argue it is the best Final Fantasy on the PS2. And I'm not even going to talk about the fucking rubbish that was Crystal Chronicles that we got on the GameCube. I bought it day one. I had the link cables. I was invested. I went all in, and the game did not live up to expectations, but that's neither here nor there. Final Fantasy X, on the other hand, delivered the goods. And to this day, I would argue Final Fantasy X was probably the last good Final Fantasy game, at least in the mainline series. We're not talking about spin-offs and etc. But X was like the game to... This was the game if you bought it... If you were buying a PS2 back in the day, you were buying it to play this game, most likely. Although there may have been other games, some of them already on this list, you bought a PS2 to play, but this was like one of the system sellers. This was the game, one of the games that was driving the astronomically insane sales of the PS2. This game was a big contributor to that. Number 3 is a game you've probably never heard of. Again, Capcom. Game should have been on GameCube. Ad nauseum, repeat again and again. You've heard this argument. But it wasn't on GameCube, even though it should have been, because all of the games in the franchise up to this point had been on Nintendo consoles. And here is a modern reimagining of a very popular Nintendo franchise, not made by Nintendo, but appearing on Nintendo consoles, a game that Nintendo gamers identified with, all of a sudden showing up on PlayStation, in this case PS2, and not being on the flagship Nintendo console. It was another punch in the gut. But once I got the PS2 version of the game and played it, I was like, alright, this game should have been on GameCube, but I'm okay with it because it's a damn good game. The game is called Maximo. It's basically the 3D entry in the Ghosts and Goblins franchise. Basically is what it is. But it's a fucking awesome game. Number 2 is Grand Theft Auto 3. This was not only a big-ass system seller, this was the game that defined the PS2. This was the game that was, like, it introduced us to the 3D open-world sandbox game. You know, it created a whole new style of game that is pervasive to this day, and is one of the best-selling franchises of all time. As big of a deal as Grand Theft Auto 3 is, it pales in comparison to number 1, which is San Andreas. San Andreas is the game to own a PS2. If you're gonna buy a PS2, back in the day, you did so to play San Andreas. If you're buying one today, it's to play San Andreas. This is the game that made the PS2 the fucking massive success it was. Every game up to San Andreas was just building up to San Andreas. It's all it was. They were just paving the way for this game to fucking take the world by goddamn storm. And yeah, Grand Theft Auto 5 is a fucking phenomenon. Skyrim is a fucking phenomenon, but this was the like legit, like one of the OG fucking phenomenons back in the day. This was like the game of all games. And even I'll admit that when I didn't have a PS2, when I had a GameCube, when I went to my friends' houses who did have PS2, this was the game they were playing. It was this game. I don't know anybody. I've never met one person who had a PS2 that didn't also have this game. This game was so ubiquitous with PS2. It's basically could have been the pack-in. And you could have told me it was the pack-in and I would have fucking believed you. This was the game of the PS2. I can't think of any other game that defines the PS2 more than San Andreas.